The walruses that we see here hauled out on the beach altogether are highly thigmotactic, and that means that they like to lie up against each other, and that is very important in the cold weather because it helps them keep warm, because they haul out on the ice when it's minus 30 or minus 40 degrees. And when they're here in the summer, they're feeding, and they're then hauling out on a beach like this one. They have a very strong degree of fidelity or faithfulness to the same area at the same time of the year. And if you were to search all up and down the coast around here for miles and miles and miles, you wouldn't find walruses anywhere else other than on this beach, with the exception of the occasional lone adult male floating around on an iceberg. They're coming and they haul out on the land and they digest their meals for a few days at a time, and then they'll go away and feed for a few days at a time. Now the seals that you see around Svalbard are quite predictable. Always the greatest numbers hauled up in the afternoon of the day, and then their minimum numbers at night, and they're down feeding. The walruses don't do that. They go out and feed for a few days at a time, so we might come down here and want to show the walruses to the passengers, and they're simply not here, and we don't know when they're going to be back. But they're here today, and they're somewhat restless. You see some of them moving around a little bit. And there's also some in the water. And that indicates that they're probably just about finished digesting whatever they've taken on board as a group, and they're getting ready to go for another feeding experience. Now, walruses are also quite inquisitive, and when they're in the water, they're completely confident of their environment, and they're not too much afraid of anything. When they're on the land, as these ones are here, you have to be very careful because you could startle them, and if you only startle one walrus and it charges for the water, the rest don't sit around and ask questions. They all go at the same time. And suddenly you have walruses crashing into the water everywhere. In large herds, that can result in some mortality of calves. A small group like this probably wouldn't make much difference. But as far as their inquisitiveness is concerned, that includes zodiacs. And although it's quite unusual, there are incidents whereby walruses have come along and actually punctured some of the air containers in the zodiacs, which is not very good for the zodiac and quite a surprise to the walruses usually. They're not being aggressive or nasty. They're mainly just young animals being investigative, because being investigative is a very important part of the role of any animal at the top of the food chain that has to search around for different sources of food or different locations where food might be. Now, we don't really know a great deal about walruses in the wintertime because their preferred habitat is in areas of moving ice where there may be polynyas. Polynya is an area of open water surrounded by ice. From some work that we've done in some small polynyas in the Canadian Arctic Islands, we found where we can camp on land and watch walruses in the water and study their breeding behavior. Now, they breed in February and March, which is also very cold, and a time when lots of the Arctic is quite inaccessible. You get large numbers of females, both with their calves or females that don't have calves anymore and are available for breeding, and they are piled up in highly thigmotactic groups like the ones we see here. But the adult males are in the breeding condition, and they go and sing in the water, and they make sounds very much like knocking on a door. They make some that sound like church bells. They make some that sound like a zither or a stringed instrument, and they also whistle, a very common part of walrus's noise-making system. And the males are singing and making these noises, and the basic function is much like that of a bird singing in a tree. They're trying to attract females for reproductive purposes. The primary diet of walruses actually is interesting for an animal as large as these, and the males in this particular subspecies get up over 3,000 pounds. And they feed on clams in the bottom of the water, and they don't use those tusks for feeding. The tusks are mainly a secondary sexual display organ, much like the antlers on a deer, which the females don't need. So they stand feeding on their heads, and they blow water out of their mouth like a little jet stream to blow sand and dirt away, and they use those big whiskers for feeling around in the mud to identify clams and separate them from rocks. And then they hold the clam in their mouth at one end. And if you looked at a clam, you'll see that one end has a little bit of a gap in it. And what they do is hold the clam in their very thick lips with that bit facing toward their mouth and their throat, and then they suck very quickly like that, and out comes the innards of the clam. They don't have the shell in their stomach to flush through their intestines, and away they go. And when you look at the face of some of these walruses, you can see that the whiskers are worn off and they're fairly short. They're abraded by the constant rubbing into the mud. And each one of those whiskers has its own nerves and muscle system so that it can operate as an independent finger. They've effectively got hundreds of little fingers feeling around, looking for the rocks and looking for the muscles that are in between them to separate what it is they're looking for from what it is they're not.